In May 1998, two officials from Australia embarked on a secret and highly illegal mission, codenamed Project Delta. At the time, UN sanctions made it illegal for any Australians to do business with Iraq. But the pair's aim was to strike a business deal with none other than the brutal dictator Saddam Hussein.
Richard, we're just going to have a look behind the scenes at two very different stories you did on completely different platforms, visiting two vastly different worlds. The first one is about two companies owned by the Reserve Bank of Australia paying bribes to win banknote printing contracts overseas. How did you get onto that story?
Well, that story started in a classic way. It started with a human contact, a source, coming forward to a colleague of mine at The Age, actually, was a personal friend of another journalist there, and because of that friendship, couldn't really do the story with that journalist, and was suggested to me because of my interest in reporting on the Australian Wheat Board. So this was back in 2008, and we had a classic first meeting in a coffee shop. Didn't know who I was looking for, but I could tell when I saw this sort of nervous guy with a little notebook in front of him that this was the guy I was going to go and see. And I can say his name now, his name's James Shelton. He worked at one of those Reserve Bank firms, a firm called Security. And James had the most amazing story that at first I didn't believe, that this arm of the Reserve Bank, governed by Reserve Bank deputy governors and senior officials, was paying bribes left, right and centre overseas to secure banknote printing contracts. It was amazing, and I went away, and I remember going back to the office and saying to my colleague and great friend Nick McKenzie, said, "You'll never guess what I just heard. You know, the RBA is paying bribes."
The two men were trying to sell the special plastic banknote technology owned by the Reserve Bank of Australia. Not only was this illegal, but both men actually worked for the RBA, the very Australian agency responsible for upholding the sanctions that the two men were so clearly breaching.
I can understand you felt sort of incredulous, right?
Well, yeah, because you do think this surely can't happen in an institution that is one of the most, highly respected and esteemed institutions in the country, one which we all rely upon to set our interest rates and, and monetary policy and things like that. It's got to be above and beyond reproach. But then when you take it a step back and you look at the industry that it was dealing in and working in through those companies, currency supply, and James, the whistleblower, and the person who first put me onto the story, said, before we go too far, I want you to find this book called, I wish I could remember it now, The Brotherhood of Money. The book was called The Brotherhood of Money. He goes, that's all about the history of the international currency printing companies. There's only about 5 in the world. My God, what a story. It's like secret agents, bribes to kings, queens, prime ministers, going back to the 30s and 40s. And when I went to find it, I actually couldn't find it. There was one copy online. And the industry has actually bought the book, which was published, I think, in the early 80s, has bought it up and had it pulped because it was so good.
Wow. So did you kind of feel like you're standing at the base of Mount Everest here?
So what we tried to do, so quickly became apparent that needed more than just my, time and skills, I guess, doing it. And it was one of the first big projects that Nick and I did together. And we chipped away. James gave us quite a good number of ins and leads and things that we could confirm or follow up on. So what we did was try and identify the middlemen or the agents that were working for Security and its sister company, Note Printing Australia, which was 100% Reserve Bank owned, whereas Security was 51% Reserve Bank owned. And we looked at the agents that they were using in countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Nigeria, Indonesia. And once we identified those agents and previous scandals that they'd been caught up in their own countries for corruption or alleged corruption, we knew we were onto something and thinking, okay, well, so where was your due diligence in this? And that led us then to another arm of the Australian government called Austrade, which is closely related to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And basically it was in some places suggesting corrupt agents for these companies to use. So the story kind of just grew legs there. And then through some other contacts, we were actually able to confirm monetary transactions between Security and these agents, which from then commission or bribes were paid to other officials.
And how long did that investigative period last? How
So
long did it
I
take?
met James first in September 2008, and we published our first story in May 2009. And I reckon during that period, 70% of my working time was on that. And our first story was pretty significant. We wanted to make a big splash. And I can remember the night before we went to publication in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald on page 1. The late Michael Gordon was Saturday editor then, and he was giving us a great backing because he knew his stuff. And I had a very worried phone call from the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank at the time, Rick Battolino. And he was just going, "You can't be going to print with this. This is preposterous. You're so wrong. We have things tightly controlled. You're going to make a fool of yourself." And that told me that level of concern that we were really onto something then. So it had the opposite effect.
So without James Shelton, none of this would have come out.
Oh, no. I mean, the story would have stayed under wraps because James isn't the type of guy just to go running to the press. I mean, his prior jobs were involved in actually working for government in like defence intelligence and other organisations that are not the most media friendly.
James Shelton decided to do what the Reserve Bank and its banknote firm directors had failed to do. He went to the cops.
And what happened to James?
James was made apparent to James that in Security, with his asking of questions, that he wasn't the right fit for that type of company, and James found himself without a career there pretty quickly.
It seems to be a story that repeats itself, that whistleblowers try to do the right thing internally, nothing happens, they go to the media, there's some publicity, but it's the whistleblowers who time and time again seem to be the ones who suffer.
Well, it punishes those trying to do the right thing. And again, in this case, on this Reserve Bank story, James was the initial whistleblower that got us going. And then there was another key one from inside Note Printing Australia, who was the company secretary there, a guy called Brian Hood. And what you've just described about the terrible impact of blowing the whistle and trying to do the right thing, Brian's a great example of just how that can go wrong for the individual.
There was a lot of stress and harassment, intimidation, a lot of hostility along the way. So it certainly set me apart.
And after our reporting, and only through our reporting, which was triggered by James, did Brian come forward and start trusting Nick and I to tell his part of the story. And through Brian, that took it up to the Reserve Bank board, and Glenn Stevens, the governor at the time, himself having to front Parliament on several occasions and give accounts for why the RBA acted in such a way.
What did the board know?
No one in the Reserve Bank or on our board had put to us those allegations before that time.
Well, it wasn't the truth. They were told in June 2007.
That wouldn't have happened without Brian. So those guys, him and James, are very brave and both paid with their careers.
Were you ever told to leave the company?
I was encouraged to leave on a couple of occasions, yes.
And what was said to you?
You don't fit in, fuck off. It was quite intimidating, no doubt about that. But on the other hand, it sort of strengthened my resolve, and it sort of empowered me in a way, in a strange sort of way, that I thought, well, I'm not going to give in to these bastards. I'm hitting a raw nerve here. I can see that things aren't right, and I'm not just going to toddle off and walk away and sort of turn a blind eye. Wimping out like that wasn't in my nature, and I wasn't going to give in.
It shows that we have been an extremely complacent country in terms of regulation, and that our regulators can be captured by the industries or the sectors that they're actually meant to police. I think we've seen it with ASIC and the Banking Royal Commission. In this case, I mean, the Reserve Bank and the Reserve Bank Board failed in their duties to oversee those companies, and ASIC did get presented a lot of information to launch a potential director's duties prosecution, a breach of director's duties, but for some reason failed to even unwrap the brief of evidence that was sent over to it.
Apart from the Deputy Governor's phone call, were there legal threats?
Yeah, we had legal threats from security lawyers for security employees, lawyers for the company, telling us that even before we went to print, that we were wrong, that we would be subject to some pretty hostile litigation. We had some lawyers for some of the agents overseas that we named as allegedly corrupt or outright corrupt. There was a memorable one where an agent overseas in Cambodia for security requested through his lawyer that we pay for his Medivac expenses out of some far-flung country, because upon reading the story online he had a heart attack. We didn't follow through on that one, but yeah, there were plenty of things like that. And actually, years later, when it came time for committal, so when the police actually charged a number of former security employees with bribery offences, Nick and I were hauled before the Melbourne Magistrates Court on what was a source application. So we'd written a story about a major development in the case, and the lawyers for some of the accused wanted us to cough up our source. And at the time there was no protection for journalists under disclosure, no journalist privilege, if you like. And we only were avoided a conviction and probably a jail sentence because the Court of Appeal came down in our favour with a really good ruling.
So you came very close to jail time.
Yeah, it was really stressful. And in fact, that was probably one of the times that other media most reported on the story, was when we were in the firing line.
All right, we might go to the second story, Wrong Skin, which is a more recent story, a podcast series that's won lots of awards, including an international award recently. Congratulations.
Thank you.
How did you, just before we get to that, how did you find transitioning from kind of a long print background, digital these days, to doing a podcast series?
Well, the first series I did was in 2016, on the death of a young Melbourne woman called Phoebe Hansjuk, in a really bizarre way, going down a garbage chute in a city apartment building. And I'd worked on that story as a print and digital journalist for quite a few years, and had got to know the family, and I felt that the way that story and then the subsequent coroner's inquest panned out, I couldn't do it justice just with writing, had to be told. And so the podcast format seemed appealing. I had no idea what I was doing and really needed a lot of support around that. We had to bring in some consultant producers and things to teach a print guy how to think audio, that sometimes less is more, leave pause, sound, different interviewing technique, all of those kind of things. And the lesson that taught me was the response to telling Phoebe's story through her family and friends, and getting into the failures of the justice system in that case had a profound impact on the public. And it really, people who never talked to me about my journalism before, all of a sudden wanted to know all about this. They'd consumed it, they'd sat through a number of hours of episodes and wanted to know more. And I thought, wow, this is a really powerful way of telling a story. So I wanted to do another one, but I just needed to find the right story.
Okay. So Wrong Skin dealt with a cold case murder, or potentially two murders, in the Kimberley region back in 1994. How did you find out about it?
Same way I found about security was through a person. My biggest rule in journalism, all stories start and end with people. And this came through a contact, an Indigenous friend I'd made on another story in the middle of Western Australia back in 2014, 2015. Keep in contact. He rang me for a chat late in 2017 and said, you should hear about this thing going up in the Kimberley, just starting to stir up again. He told me the bare bones of the story about this, doomed young couple in this remote community who wanted to be together but couldn't because of their skin rules, and they weren't allowed to be together under those customs. But she'd also been promised to a man 3 times her age as a promised wife. And she and he went missing in the wet season, and then her body turns up about 2 k's out of town 11 months later, and the young guy's never been seen, never been sighted since. And I thought, wow, I've got to find out about this. This is an amazing story. In 20 years of journalism, this is the most compelling story I've ever come across. A story which until now hasn't had one word written about it.
We know there's been a lot of killings. Flood time is when people disappear.
They were frightened of that man there, bad, all those people, and he knew it and he acted upon it too.
After 24 years of silence, people are starting to talk about the wet season of 1994 and the suspicious death of a young Aboriginal mother and the disappearance of her boyfriend. He's now presumed dead.
In that search, we found a bowerbird nest, and in that bowerbird nest were some knuckles, of human knuckles.
Everybody is too frightened of them. They rule over everybody. Nobody can say nothing.
She was a young mum, with an 8-year-old daughter, and she's only 23. And I would thought if she was a white Australian woman living in a capital city, disappeared under such circumstances and then was found partially clothed under a tree, we'd all know her name, there'd be a reward, there'd be plenty of media interest. So why wasn't there one word written about these guys?
Why wasn't there? Why do you think that there wasn't?
1994, no one knew. The story hadn't got out of the community really. The police did as much as they could, but they didn't publicise the investigation. I think there were some issues of trust perhaps between the community and some of the police, although the initial detective on it was really good. And nothing was published by the WA coroner. They didn't have a lot to go on, because I think there's a really powerful thing for me that I found up there was the power of fear of talking out and the consequences of that when you're in the middle of nowhere and there's people that you suspect might know something or are involved, and in a hierarchy there they have more power than you. So that's what we had to break through.
I'll just go back a step. What is wrong skin?
My understanding is it is in a community, people belong to different skin groups and have different skin names and under the rules, and they differ from all different parts of Australia. But in this community, these two were of the wrong skin group. They couldn't be together. They couldn't be romantically involved like that. And for them to be doing that in breach of their mob's, traditional beliefs. So I tried to understand that concept and explain that in the podcast. And I think the name Wrong Skin conveys quite a few meanings on different levels, which is why I was attracted to that name. But it was the first thing I wrote in my notebook. This is Wrong Skin, a podcast that goes beyond true crime. Like me, you've got to be prepared to leave your comfort zone and come to a part of Australia few of us know enough about. This is about love, power, fear and consequence, and telling the untold story of 2 young people who appear to have paid the highest price for being in love.
It's been gone too long, and, somebody have to stop it.
Yeah, time's critical because we as investigative journalists are asking people to trust us with their stories, in some cases with their livelihoods or their well-being, and that isn't given lightly, and nor should it be. And the only way you can get that is by face-to-face connection, time, understanding, and being a good listener, you know. And the way of modern media, even with, you know, social media and things like that, everything demands instant feedback, instant attention, instant reporting. And that's great, but to actually sort of get beneath the layers of what's superficial and what's, you know, the real story here, and win that trust from people to allow you to tell that real story, you just need time.